When Muhammad Ali refused to shake Clint Eastwood's hand, the silence inside the studio felt heavier than the lights hanging from the ceiling. 12 million people were watching. The audience had been laughing only seconds earlier. It was supposed to be a celebration, two American icons meeting for the first time. But when Clint extended his hand, steady and calm, Ali looked at it and did not move. The air shifted. Ali's eyes weren't playful. They weren't joking. They burned with something older than anger, something forged in courtrooms, hate mail, and exile. "I don't shake hands with men who stayed quiet while others paid the price," Ali said. A gasp rolled through the studio like a sudden storm. Clint didn't pull his hand back. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He just let it hang there for a second longer, then slowly lowered it. What nobody watching knew, what even Ali didn't know, was that this moment had been building for 13 years. To understand that silence, you have to go back to 1967. Houston, Texas. A crowded induction center. Nervous young men. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The smell of sweat and fear in the air. Cassius Marcellus Clay. No movement. They called it again. Silence. A third time. Still nothing. Muhammad Ali stood calm, composed, unshaking. He would not step forward. He would not wear the uniform. He would not fight in a war he did not believe in. Within hours, the world turned on him. Stripped of his heavyweight championship. Banned from boxing. Passport revoked. Facing prison time. Sponsors gone. Broadcasters erased him from screens. At 25 years old, the absolute prime of his career, he lost everything. But he gained something else. Conviction. The entire nation watched him fall. Half called him a traitor. Half called him brave. But everyone knew he had stood alone. Or so he thought. 1 year later, in a quiet office in Los Angeles, another man stared at a letter that could end his life as he knew it. Clint Eastwood had already tasted fame. The Westerns were hitting. His name was growing. He was becoming a symbol, the quiet, unbreakable American cowboy. Then the draft notice came. His agent leaned forward and said 3 words that echoed like a warning. "Don't be Ali." Meaning, don't ruin your career. Don't challenge the machine. Don't make yourself a headline. Clint had served before, years earlier during peacetime. He understood discipline. He understood loyalty. But he also understood doubt. And doubt had been growing. He knew he could not look into a camera and encourage young men to fight a war he himself questioned. But he also knew something painful. He wasn't Muhammad Ali. He didn't have a platform big enough to survive public defiance. So he made a choice. Not loud. Not dramatic. Not televised. He filed a quiet moral objection. No press conference. No speeches. Just paperwork and fear. And then came the cost. Studio contracts stalled. Projects delayed. Phone calls slowed. Whispers began. He wasn't attacked publicly. That would have required acknowledging his stand. But doors closed without explanation. He was told to keep it quiet. No politics. No statements. Just act. Just smile. Just let the world assume you're patriotic. And so he did. The military eventually reclassified him quietly. No spotlight. No headlines. Just a file stamped and shelved. He went back to work. The public saw toughness. Strength. Gunslinging confidence. What they didn't see was the quiet compromise of surviving in silence. For 13 years, he watched Muhammad Ali rebuild his life publicly. The comeback fights. The global respect. The transformation from villain to hero. And every time Ali spoke about standing alone, Clint felt something twist inside him. Because he hadn't been alone. He had just been invisible. Now back to that studio. Ali's words still hung in the air. "I don't shake hands with men who stayed quiet." Clint stepped closer. "You think you were the only one who paid a price?" he said quietly. The audience leaned forward. Ali frowned. "What are you saying?" Clint reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded, yellowed document. "My draft objection. Filed 1968. Ali's confidence flickered. "You?" he asked. "Yes." Silence. "I didn't go public," Clint continued. "I didn't have your voice. I didn't have your power. But I couldn't go either. So I said no, quietly." Ali stared at him, searching for arrogance, for ego, for an angle. There was none. "Why didn't you stand with us?" Ali asked. Clint's answer was calm. "Because you were strong enough to carry the weight publicly. I wasn't. If I'd tried, I would have been erased before I ever became anything. You chose to be a symbol. I chose to survive." The studio was no longer watching two celebrities. They were watching two men untangle pride. Clint reached into his coat again and pulled out a small leather notebook. I kept track, he said. Names. Men who resisted quietly. Athletes who disappeared. Teachers who lost licenses. Musicians who left the country. Fathers who went to prison. They weren't famous. Nobody interviewed them. Nobody defended them. They just faded. He opened it. Pages filled with names. Ali's shoulders slowly dropped. You weren't alone, Clint said softly. None of us were. We just didn't know each other. The tension in Ali's face melted into something deeper, recognition. Years of believing he stood isolated, cracked in that moment. After the show, backstage, without cameras or applause, they sat across from each other in silence. Clint removed a small bronze military pin from his pocket. A wounded soldier gave this to me, he said. He told me he wished more men had refused. Said maybe he wouldn't have gone. He placed it in Ali's hand. Ali looked at it for a long time. Then he removed a simple leather cord from around his neck. My mother gave me this the day I refused, he said. She told me to stand even if I stand alone. He handed it to Clint. You didn't stand loud, Ali said. But you stood. And for the first time that night, Ali extended his hand again. This time, Clint took it. Not as icons, not as symbols, but as two men who had chosen differently, yet paid in similar ways. The world would never fully know the details. History doesn't always record the quiet resistance. It remembers the loudest voices, the boldest defiance. But sometimes courage isn't about volume. Sometimes it's about integrity when nobody's watching. And sometimes the heaviest handshake is the one that takes 13 years to complete. The studio lights were still burning hot, but the air felt cold. Clint's hand was still hanging there, suspended between pride and humiliation. Muhammad Ali didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. The silence was louder than anything that had been said that night. The audience didn't clap. They didn't gasp. They didn't even whisper. Because everyone in that room knew something bigger than a handshake had just happened. Clint slowly lowered his hand. Not angrily, not dramatically, just slowly. His jaw tightened. For a split second, something flashed in his eyes. Not rage, not embarrassment. Recognition. Ali adjusted his jacket slightly and leaned closer to the desk mic. His voice was calm, controlled, but it carried weight. I don't shake hands with symbols, he said quietly. The words didn't echo. They settled. Clint let out a slow breath through his nose. And what symbol am I? He asked. Ali looked at him, not like an enemy, but like a man asking another man to understand. You represent silence, Ali replied. And I've fought too hard against silence. The room felt smaller. The cameras kept rolling. America was watching. Clint leaned back in his chair. His fingers tapped once on the armrest. The sound was subtle, but sharp in the quiet studio. You think I've been silent? Clint asked. Ali didn't answer immediately. He studied him. You never spoke when it mattered, Ali said. And when you have a voice like yours, that's a choice. The audience shifted. Some uncomfortable, some reflective, some defensive. Clint nodded slowly. And you think refusing a handshake makes you righteous? Ali finally allowed the smallest hint of a smile. No, he said. It makes me consistent. The words hit harder than anger ever could. Clint stood up, not in rage, not to leave, but to face him fully. The host tried to interject, but instinct told him to stay quiet. This wasn't television anymore. This was two philosophies colliding in real time. Clint stepped closer. You don't know what I've carried, he said, low enough that it almost didn't reach the mic. Ali stood too. And you don't know what I refuse to carry. The tension was electric now. Not violent. Not chaotic. Just heavy. Clint's voice lowered even more. You think it's easy to be patriotic when you're confused? When you don't trust the orders, but you don't want to betray the flag either? Ali's eyes softened for the first time. I never betrayed the flag, he said. I refused to betray myself. That landed differently. Clint's posture shifted. Not defeated, but reflective. You ever wonder, Clint said, if maybe we were fighting different battles, but both trying to protect something? Ali hesitated. Just for a second. The audience leaned in unconsciously. I protect lives, Ali said. Not narratives. Clint gave a small nod. And I protect the idea that a country can change, even when it's flawed. The room wasn't divided anymore. It was thinking. Clint looked down at his own hand, the same one that had been refused moments earlier. He flexed it once. Then he looked back up at Ali. What if, Clint said quietly, this isn't about agreeing, but about acknowledging. Ollie studied him carefully. What are you asking? Clint didn't extend his hand this time. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The movement made security tense slightly, but Clint moved slowly. He pulled out something small. Metal. Worn. A military pin. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he held it up. Not as pride, not as defiance, but as history. I kept this, he said, to remind myself that I once followed orders without asking enough questions. The audience was frozen. I don't regret serving, he continued, but I regret not asking louder. Ollie's breathing changed slightly, not visible to most, but Clint noticed. Clint stepped closer, not threatening, just honest. He held the pin out. I don't need you to shake my hand, he said, but I need you to know. I've been listening. That was different. Ollie looked at the pin, then at Clint, then at the audience, then back at Clint. You listening now? Ollie said softly. Or listening because the cameras are here? Clint didn't hesitate. I've been listening long before tonight. A long pause. Ollie reached forward. Not for the hand. For the pin. He held it carefully between his fingers. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't grand. It was worn. Human. Ollie looked at it, then back at Clint. You know what scares people? Ollie said. Clint waited. Change. Ollie answered himself. And pride, Clint added quietly. Ollie almost smiled. Almost. You still don't get a handshake, Ollie said. A few soft laughs broke the tension in the audience. But, Ollie continued, you get something more dangerous. Clint raised an eyebrow slightly. Accountability. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Clint nodded. I can live with that. Ollie placed the pin back in Clint's palm. Then, he did something unexpected. He stepped forward, and instead of extending his hand, he placed his hand briefly over Clint's shoulder. Not acceptance, not endorsement, but acknowledgement. The audience finally reacted, not with roaring applause, but with a slow, rising, thoughtful clapping. Because they weren't clapping for agreement. They were clapping for honesty. For two men who refused to pretend. For tension that didn't explode, but evolved. Clint leaned closer, voice low enough for only Ollie to hear. You know this will follow us. Ollie nodded. So will the silence we break. They stepped back. The host finally exhaled and tried to regain control of the show. But it didn't matter, because something irreversible had already happened. The cameras zoomed out. Two men standing under studio lights. Not enemies, not friends, but forces. The handshake never happened, but something stronger did. Understanding without surrender. Conviction without hatred. Respect without agreement. And somewhere across America, in living rooms lit by television glow, people were arguing. People were questioning. People were thinking. And maybe, that was the real victory. The credits would roll later. The headlines would spin their versions. But history? History would remember the space between two hands. And the courage it took to leave it empty. Fade to black.